I'm going to take you through a very important game in the same age variation, at least in the past, or the recent past, since it was a World Championship game between Anand and Kramnik played in Bonn. This is the second game of the match, so nothing had already been decided, still everything to play for. And Kramnik with the black pieces utilizes his very trusty Nimzi Indian defense to deal with 1d4. Now, Anand is not known to be a same-ish player, but perhaps he thought it a good idea to surprise his opponent in the very first white that he had by playing the move f3. Now, of course, Kramnik, being a very thorough theoretician, probably the most important theoretician in the recent past, knows a lot of ways of dealing with the same-ish, but in this case chooses the sharp continuation that I was recommending with d5, a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, c5. And we're going to go down one of the variations that I just looked at in the opening summary. After c takes d5, knight takes d5, dc5, f5, queen c2. Remember that I said that this position can also be reached after e4, pawn takes e4, queen c2. So queen c2, knight d7, e4, f takes e4, f takes e4, knight 5, f6. And here Anand chooses to disrupt the pawn structure on the queen side with c6, which of course strategically is very desirable. On the other hand, it allows black quick access to the a6 square, and we'll see how Kramnik utilizes that in just a second. After the move c6, b takes c6, knight f3, queen a5 is the move that I'm recommending, and Anand played the very natural bishop d2. Notice that he waits a little bit to develop this bishop on f1, and the reason that he does that is that he knows that black's next move, or perhaps the move after, is going to be bishop to a6. Trading off these light square bishops is extremely important for the black side, since it destroys the pair of bishops for white, and it allows black to start pressuring e4, to pressure c4 in many scenarios, to put the queen on c4 or a knight, and achieve a strategically very desirable position. After bishop d2, however, I am going to deviate a little bit from what Kramnik did. He played the immediate bishop a6, which I don't think is very wrong. I think it's probably a good move. But personally, I like the idea of castling first. And it goes back to the point that I want to wait for that bishop on f1 to develop before I play bishop a6. I think modern theory has shown that after bishop a6, there's a very slight pull for white after bishop takes a6, queen takes a6, and c4. However, bishop a6 is not a bad move at all. I just think that castles is slightly more precise. For example, bishop d3, bishop a6, c4, queen c7 should leave black in a perfectly good position, as I will follow up with at some point knight c5, or also knight g4 with pressure on h2. Notice that this rook is now open, or by remaneuvering this knight back to e5, where it again targets this d3 bishop. Probably the best move after castles is to simply play bishop e2, but here again bishop a6 is a completely satisfactory move compared to the line that I was a little bit preoccupied about after bishop takes a6, queen takes a6, c4. I basically got in a move for free, which is to castle short, and that changes the evaluation of the position completely. I have ability to play knight g4 right away, or even the move queen b6, preventing white from castling kingside. But let's take a look at what happened in the game and see how strategically complex this position is. After bishop a6, Anand thought for some time to play the move c4, which I think is a great approach to this position, very logical in the sense that it keeps the bishops for white. After c4, Kramnik might have wanted to play initially the move queen c7, and I already explained how queen c7 coordinates very well with the rest of his pieces, especially with this knight jump to g4 being a very common idea. However, after bishop b4, it's possible that white is just in time to prevent a lot of black's ideas. For example, the bishop is cutting the f8 square, so I cannot castle kingside, and I don't have knight c5, which I would love to play. c5 is a little bit awkward because after I play bishop c3, this bishop is in a very good spot, and now it's prevented me from going to c5. If somehow white takes control over the e5 square, my knights are going to be quite awkward. For this reason, Kramnik decided to play the move queen c5. Now a very logical series of moves. Bishop d3. Notice that unfortunately for Vladimir, he cannot castle short. He must wait for it. If he castles short at any point here, bishop b4, queen e3 check, queen e2 will force the trade of queens and a slightly worse endgame. He wants to keep the queens on the board and prevent white from castling for now. That's why after bishop d3 he plays the very logical move knight g4, and after bishop b4, queen e3 check, queen e2, he decides to long castle to try to create some initiative with the tempi that he has. I think that this is a very important approach in many types of Nimzo Indians in which you are up tempo compared to, for example, material or the pair of bishops. And in this case, I think Black is using the time that he has to create complications on the board. Queen e3 was played, and notice that a move like bishop e7 might already become dangerous for white. The point of bishop e7 is to simply disrupt the coordination of Black's pieces, hoping that after rook fe8, I have something along the lines of bishop g5, and after the more or less forced trade of queens, I'll be able to consolidate. But bishop e7 kind of runs into queen b6, bishop d8, rook d8, and notice that since I have been able to eliminate the pair of bishops, white's pieces and white's play really lacks coordination. Also, it's very important to notice that since white's king is stuck on e1, it is difficult for him to do very much in this position. Black has enough compensation here, and I think that this would have led to a very weird position, playable for both sides. After a long castle, queen takes c3, knight takes c3, king f2, knight g4 check, king g3, we reached a very strange endgame. The king on g3 is obviously a vulnerability, but on the other hand, it's difficult to get to it without a dark squared bishop. White's bishops are both good and bad. They have potential. This bishop on the dark squares can be anchored on d6. It can go to a5. It can disrupt the rooks. On the other hand, the bishop on d3, for now, is quite a sad piece. And I think that in this particular moment, Kramnik really underestimated Anand's idea. Sergei Shipov, in his annotations of the game, had pointed out that knight g5, bishop e2, and now the destruction again of the pair of bishops with bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, rook h c1, knight d5 might lead to a very complex endgame in which white probably still slightly preferred, but not by much, and it's difficult to say what the evaluation of the position truly is. Instead, in this position after king g3, Kramnik went with a very logical move knight df6, which attacks this bishop and puts pressure on e4, and it puts pressure on c4. So it's basically asking the question, what are you going to do with your bishop? If either one of these rooks goes to d1, I have the move knight e3, putting pressure on, let's say, this rook, on this pawn on c4, and on the rook on d1. Tactically very complicated, but Anand came up with an absolutely great idea. Bishop b1. You'll see that in the Nimzo Indian, the strategical elements of sacrificing pawns to keep your coordination alive are very important and difficult to master. In this case, bishop e1 is a very important move. I don't quite have time to take on c4 because of e5, and that wins a piece for white. But the real idea after bishop b1 is that I am going to sacrifice this pawn on c4 eventually. I really don't care about it because it allows me access to c1, and because I'm able to, more importantly, retain the activity of my bishops. e5 for the moment is a threat. h5 was played. And again, the idea was never to play e5 after h5, because after h4 check, white is running into a little bit of trouble. If he takes on h4, I'll be happy to take on e5, and my coordination is suddenly very, very good, especially with this awkward knight on h4. Instead, after e4, e5, h4, king f4, the move g5 might already be quite dangerous for the white side. I believe that after h5, which is a very logical move as it goes towards the king on g3, Anand had already prepared this idea of playing h3. There is no way for me to play this knight to a good square. If I play something like knight e3, my knight's starting to become stranded in this position, and both bishop c5 taking a7, or simply this knight jumping to e5, f7 hanging, c6 hanging, and in some cases c4 cannot even be taken because of pins with c1 or pins with d3, leaves black in a terrible position. Instead, Kramnik does a very practical try in an already bad position to play h4 check, distract this knight, knight takes h4, and knight e5. Now, of course, compared to the variation that we saw previously, white is up a pawn, but Kramnik's still fighting. He at least has active pieces, and his pawn on c4 is still a target, his pawn on e4 is still a target, and notice that he hasn't given Anand the time to consolidate his bishop on b1 and put it in a good square. After knight f3, knight h5 check, king f2, knight takes f3, king takes f3, e5. Black has some compensation, but it's certainly not enough. However, with the active pieces that he has and the vulnerable king on f3, it is difficult from a practical aspect to really evaluate this position. Perhaps at this point, Anand could have played a little bit better. He goes for the greedy rook c1, which protects the pawn. I find this very logical, but bishop c2 was perhaps a little bit of a stronger move, trying to go to a4 and exploiting the fact that bishop takes c4 will always open these lines on the c-file against the king. Rook c1, however, is hardly a bad move. I think that this was also good after knight f4, white still retains a strong advantage. I believe that rook a2 was a very logical continuation, trying to bring the rook out into the game towards the second. Knight d3, rook c3, knight f4. Unable to really find a plan, Kramnik tries to create tactical pressure on his opponent's pieces. The point of this retreat is to ask the question, how are you going to deal with the invasion of the rook on d1? And notice that even though this is a very easy position to evaluate with a computer, it's very hard on a practical game to really understand what's going on. And keeping this kind of resources alive not only confuses your opponents, but lets you pull positions from bad ones to playable ones. And in this case, even a great Vishy Anand, under tremendous pressure playing a world championship match, wasn't able to really evaluate the position clearly. Even in the final one, after bishop c2, knight e6, king g3, rook d4, it's unclear that black has quite enough compensation for the pawn. On the other hand, this rook on d4 is quite strong, this pawn on c4 will be quite weak, and notice how I still haven't given these bishops too much to do. I haven't allowed them to come back and play. White's coordination is lacking, and although a computer might be able to tell you that black is indeed much worse, he has a lot of play, and it's difficult for white to parry all the threats. My pieces are quite alive. I have plans of playing rook h6, rook g6, e4 is weak, the knight can always return to f4. And after offering a draw, which was accepted, the game ended peacefully in a very important showing of the same-ish variation with f5 in the highest class of chess.